Sister Mary Rao was here some years ago. She participated in one of our July Institutes, the Bearers of the Tradition. And so we are extremely disappointed, and she is very disappointed. She says that she could not come a second time, but we're just glad you're here at all in any way, Mary Rao. I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce her. You've all read about her. You know that she's thoroughly conversant in the topic in which she will be leading us. She's a sister of St. Joseph from Canada. And at the moment, she is the Vocation and Formation Director for the Sisters of St. Joseph in Canada and President of the National Association of Vocation and Formation Directors in Canada. And that's how we came across her name. She was a guest speaker at the United States National Association, and Betty Souther happened to have the brochure that described Mary as speaking on the very thing we were looking for a speaker for. So she fell into our arms a couple of years ago. She lives at the Villa St. Joseph Ecology and Spiritual Center in Cobourg, Ontario. She leads retreats and courses and is a spiritual director. She provides retreats, workshops, and facilitation services across Canada and the United States. And if that's not enough, she teaches courses in moral theology, Catholic social tradition, and leadership ethics at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Theology at St. Michael's and Regis colleges. But I like her background. Just listen to this. She's formerly a nurse and nurse educator. She's worked in healthcare and education in the United Kingdom, Canada, numerous countries in Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and Eastern Europe, and specialized in ophthalmological and blindness prevention programs. She has also worked in the field of clinical bioethics at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto and at St. Joseph's Hospital in London, Ontario, and as a researcher for the Canadian Catholic Bioethics Institute. She has a bachelor's degree in philosophy, a master's in medical law and ethics from the University of London in the United Kingdom, and a doctorate in theology from the University of Durham in the United Kingdom, where her research focused on the interface of bioethics, theology, and ecology. So Mary is here to connect the dots, and you can see she is perfectly capable of doing that. So Mary, we are so happy to have you, and we welcome you to this 24th Annual Theological Institute. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Marcia, and thank you all for showing up for this.
Mary, you're muted.
Must have.
Something here.
I had my cursor right over it. Well, it's a tremendous privilege. I've been hearing about the Institute for many years, and how important it's been in so many lives. So it's a tremendous privilege. And as Marcia said, I would love to have been down there to be with all of you, particularly those who are hidden away in that room there, that larger room. And Donna Smith also was hoping to come down. She was getting on the bandwagon to come down with me. We were trying to scrape up the money so that she could come as my technical assistant, because she's been wonderful being my technical assistant in many presentations. So we're sad, but we're also delighted to be here with you on Zoom. And we welcome you at our end to Canada, and Christine Carbot is here too from Canada. And I know that many of you know both Donna and Christine from their time with you in Concordia. And, and so we welcome you, and our retreat center here is right on the shores of Lake Ontario. And so we live in a very beautiful space of creation. But what I wanted to warn you is the irony is that at the moment we have tornadoes around us. So should we disappear at any point, you'll know what's happened. And I said it's kind of ironic that we would be the ones with tornadoes forecast when you're sitting in Kansas, which is the only place I've ever discovered in hotels have tornado shelters. So it seems to be a little bit of a reversal, but we'll hope that nothing happens here. Although we do pray for one of the small towns just the other side of Toronto who were hit very badly, Barrie, with a tornado this afternoon with quite a few injuries and a great deal of damage. So we'll hold them in our prayers. And I just wanted to say this is entitled, of course, Ecology and Theology, and an invitation through that to new life. Although I'm not going to use it explicitly tonight, I will also be including some reflections that relate to that on the pandemic. And so we'll be weaving that in to the talks in the next couple of days. So again, it's a huge privilege and joy to be with you all. Some of you I know and others not, but lovely to see some that I do in fact know and to meet all of you. So again, thank you for being here tonight. I'll try not to put you off for the rest of the few days, so we'll keep showing up together. I'm just going to now, I thought it was easier than having to sort of listen to me all the time, for us to use PowerPoint for these sessions. And so it gives us something visual as well. So I'm just going to go to screen share, and hopefully it will come up. And there we are. Are you all able to see this? I'm just about to go to the slideshow. Is everyone able to see the
Yes, Mary.
PowerPoint?
Yes, Mary, we see it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, we started with that beautiful prayer from Pope Francis and Laudato Si, and that's something that gives us hope. And by the end of these few days, I hope that we will have some hope. But I'm going to start off with a problem, the fundamental problem that was identified some time ago by Thomas Berry, a Passionist priest, and he called himself a geologian. That was mainly to keep himself out of trouble with the church at the time, who was not really ready to hear his message. The fundamental problem, Tom Berry said, was that the earth has just served as a backdrop to human existence and activity. And in a very, very good paper, which actually you can Google if you're interested, called Ethics and Ecology, that he delivered at Harvard in 1996, Tom Berry said this: the natural world surrounding us is simply the context in which human affairs take place. Our relations with this more encompassing community are different from our relations to the human world. In the presence of the human, the natural world has no rights. So he emphasizes this fact that we have really created Earth as some sort of backdrop to the main scene being us. And he said that that is the primary underlying problem as to why we are not addressing issues adequately in terms of ecological difficulties. And so I just wanted to start so that you have an opportunity. I know a few of you are on your own. Others are with one or two other people, and then the large room um, at Manor House. And I just wanted to start with just a little bit of feedback from us all. And ask these two questions, and you might want to either just jot them down if you're on your own, or you may wish to turn to somebody that you're with. What does the earth mean in your life? And secondly, what are your hopes for our time together? So perhaps we could start out with a little bit of conversation so the whole group is involved. What does the earth mean in your life? And what are your hopes for our time together? And so let's just take a few moments to reflect on that and have some conversation with one another. I will stop sharing for a few moments so I'm more engaged with you.
Mary, did you want us to verbally share with it here?
I just thought you take a few moments and then I'll invite people to
Okay.
some sharing. Is that okay? Thanks, Susan. So I'd invite anyone who feels ready, if you would like to share a little bit on either or both. What does the earth mean in your life? And what hopes do you have for these days we're spending together? And I know those in the larger grouping, if you're able to, you can come to the microphone. So.
Yep. If you'd like to share from over there, you need to come here. We can't bring it to you, I'm sorry.
So any offers here? What does the earth mean to you? And what hopes do you have for this time together? And remember, you're all muted, so.
Well, I would just, we were talking, Faye and I, and we were saying that the earth is everything to us. It's everything. We wouldn't even be here if we didn't have this planet, this earth, the air, the water, everything that is here, the soil. And I think we're getting a little more aware of what's going on, but we need to continue that very, very clearly. And so our hope is simply to grow during this time, to have more conversations, seeing what we might be able to do even with Laudato Si. So that's my comment.
Thank you.
This is Diane. I think for me, I feel like there is a mutuality between humankind and the earth. We're responsible for the life of the earth, and the earth is responsible for our life. And so without that mutuality, neither will survive.
I love that word, responsible. I love the idea of being responsible for one another. Yes. And Marguerite, I think you put, it was you, I think, put something in chat. And so that was helpful too, about the beauty of the earth. And from Denise in the chat. So those chats from Marguerite, earth means beauty and core connection, hopes, insights that motivate and encourage action. And Denise, to recognize a new masterpiece each day and appreciate and be responsive to its needs. Thank you for those. Anyone else? Janet, yes.
I think that the earth is a home for everybody, for everybody, whether it's for the, I mean, it's just for everybody, for everything. And so I think my hope is here is that we can feel so connected that we share that responsibility for the common good of the life of the earth, which also is the life for each other.
Thank you, Janet. And of course, that emphasis on our common home that Pope Francis gives to Laudato Si, I think really tries to emphasize that. Anyone else?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
This is Regina Ann. I've been living in Indian country for a long time, at least 50 years or so. And
Yes.
it just so happens that most native people think of the earth as related, as family.
Mm-hmm.
We're all family, we're all related. Everything in the earth, the sky, everything, the animals, the people, we are all one family. And that way we need to take care of each other constantly.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you so much. And the Ojibwe peoples here constantly say that, as you're pointing out, all our relations, all our
Yes.
relations.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the one way that even the Sisseton Wahpeton people down in South Dakota say, all my relations.
Yeah, yes.
Every language has that. Mhm.
Yes, beautiful. Thank you very much, Regina.
Yeah.
And then Donna sent a chat. Earth gives hope with natural beauty. It is green space beneath my feet that gives me life, provides glimpses into the wild side of our ecosystems. It provides food and shelter for all creation. Thank you, Donna.
I think also
Miriam? Oh,
with
sorry.
Pope, hi. I think also with Pope Francis's lead for congregations to be involved in developing their own Laudato Si action plans, which we're in a
Yes.
very preliminary stage to do. Our intent, I believe, is to help create a broader awareness of so many of the issues that many people are not as aware of as our congregation is, with having an enactment on ecological integrity, et cetera. So, how we go about building awareness for the broader community.
Thank you, Christina. Yeah, absolutely. And it is that invitation, that the title that was given to this session. We're invited to choose new life, but I think it's to help all of us to choose new life. And we all know that can be quite difficult. In the diocese I come from originally, in England, the Diocese of East Anglia, I've seen a magnificent example of post Laudato Si initiative. Almost as soon as it was published, the bishop of that diocese, who interestingly enough is a former Episcopal priest, and he almost immediately put together a day, and he presided at a mass in the cathedral, and he asked every single parish to send two people from their parish who would become leaders. It was kind of that apostleship model. And they celebrated this beautiful mass of creation. And then the folks who were there spent the rest of the day in workshops looking through Laudato Si. Then, of course, all of them went back to their parishes. And I have to tell you, many of these parishes are tiny little English villages. There's only a sort of few larger cities in that area. They're kind of small villages. Every single church followed through on it. And those two people became responsible for Laudato Si education and activation. And what has come out of that is just absolutely amazing. These little churches started to ask how they could live more simply. And they started out with basic things like selling fair trade coffee, etc., at the back. And then they invited people for whom recycling was a bit of an inconvenience, just to throw everything in a box and to bring it to church when they came to Mass on Sunday. And they had these big recycling bins that on Monday, some of the retired parishioners in each church went through it all, sorted it, and took it to the various recycling centers. And from that, they grew and grew like Topsy. And they started to have an award, which CAFOD in England gave, for parishes that demonstrated simpler living in light of Laudato Si. And then from there, they expanded to partnerships with parishes in other countries too, particularly poorer countries. It was just amazing. But it was that initiative of the bishop to leap in right at the beginning And I don't know about your churches, but I'm pretty sure that I have never ever heard Laudato Si mentioned in any of our parishes that I've been in. So it was a great initiative. And so these are the things I think that we're invited to for New Life as we reflect. And so is there are there any other comments anyone would like to make before we move on? Oh, Miriam, are you?
I did. First of all, I come from the deep South, Georgia, and Southerners have had a love for the land, and I guess somehow it was handed down to me. And not that I lived on a farm, but it was just going out at nighttime and swinging in the swing and looking up at the stars in the sky. And just from little on, that to me was finding God. And so finding God in nature has just been second nature to me. But as I've grown older and we hear so much more about the importance of the earth and global warming and climate change, etc., it becomes even more precious to me. And so I was thinking of what you had up about Thomas Berry and the fundamental problem that we see the earth as a backdrop. And I think that's so sad because with a backdrop, and it's almost like, well, it's stage scenery, you do with it what you want. And
Yes.
I think that's probably been our attitude too long towards the earth. We don't see it as part of creation, as part of God's image also. And so that to me is sad. And anything that I can learn from this workshop in the sense of tying in the theology, the spirituality with saving the earth, not only saving it, but valuing it and seeing God in it in new ways, in a deeper way, I think, is what I hope to hear from other people and get from you. So
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you.
Thank you.
And a beautiful story. Actually, I've got a story about Georgia tomorrow, I think, if I recall rightly. But a beautiful story. And do you know, I can't help thinking that that's one way. That is one really significant way that we can begin to share on love of the earth and care for the earth is by storytelling. Storytelling groups. I think sometimes we undervalue or underestimate the power of story. And so it's lovely to hear those sorts of stories. So thank you, Miriam. And so before I push on, did anyone else wish to say anything? Okay, there will be opportunities as we go through these days. So I'm going to go back to screen share now, I hope. And let's just begin to look and unravel some of these issues. So if the earth has been a backdrop for us, for many people, what I'm hoping that we might do together, listening to your voice too, is to do a little bit of foregrounding in these next few days, to bring these considerations front and center to our consciousness, our attention, and our care, in order to emphasize that primacy of the earth when we look at priorities in our society and in our faith tradition. So just so you know where we're going, this is our time together. This is the way I've kind of chosen some, I mean, obviously, we could spend a year or more at this, but we have a few days. So I tried to choose things that I felt were pivotal, some of which you may already know, but perhaps when we share them, perhaps when we share them, we can help others as well to bring it to the foreground. So tonight, I'm just going to do a theology and ecology overview and set the context for the days to follow. In other words, kind of a bird's eye view. Now, I hope that's not too repetitive for some of you who will have had some of this before, but I think it's always good to hear those echoes in our minds and our hearts, and really it's to bring everyone, if you like, onto sort of a level playing field as we move into the next couple of days. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to ask that question, who am I? Who are we? And do some reflection on theological anthropology, the place of the human in creation. Tomorrow afternoon, I wanted to look at a community of kinship with nature. And you've already mentioned that in terms of the indigenous cultures who speak of all our relations. On Saturday morning, I'm going to ask the question, sorry, I didn't put a question mark there, was Jesus an ecologist? Now, I have to warn you, I decided grandly about a year ago that I was going to offer a retreat here for a day, an input retreat, with that title, Was Jesus an Ecologist? And I have to tell you, for the first time in my life, I had to eat really big humble pie in terms of retreats because nobody signed up. They probably looked at the title and thought, you know, is this woman crazy? Was Jesus an ecologist is the question I'm going to ask on Saturday morning. And so please don't be like the potential retreatants who don't show. I discovered in some reading some really fascinating work on that by a Spanish theologian. So we'll look at that so that we can focus a little bit there on the gospel, but then also to come from the historical Jesus to look at Christology in creation. What is the place of Christ in creation? And then Saturday afternoon, look at embracing eco-justice. And I've mentioned contemplation and action as one of the key components of a response to the situation. So Saturday afternoon, we'll be unraveling some practical approaches that we might take. And then Sunday morning, I sincerely hope we might be a little bit more hope-filled, considering that I started off tonight with a problem. So, so that's really the way that I planned and put these days together, and I hope that they will be helpful for us. And so what then is happening in the world? Well, they are things that we particularly know, because the earth is crying out. Pope Francis, for example, in Laudato Si, and most of the writers on it would say that there are issues, as we know, of pollution, waste, and a throwaway culture. And I'll speak about that throwaway culture in terms of a culture of convenience as well. And all of the issues most impact those who are poor or marginalized. They speak to us of global inequalities, but I think we also, as we reflect on what's happening in our world at the moment, the upsurge of racism in all of our countries. I think, you know, being a Brit, if anyone watches soccer, I was totally ashamed of many Brits in their response to England losing that match against Italy. If there are any Italians there, congratulations. But it also really amplifies racism. And if you've been in touch with any Canadian news, you'll know that we are currently going through horrors, particularly those of us who are Catholics and those of us in religious communities, with the discovery of numerous bodies of Indigenous children. And so that this is a very difficult time, because of course that whole government initiative was indeed to beat the Indian out of the child. And I'm not meaning to be disrespectful in saying that. I'm just saying that that's what happened. And yet all of the richness that our Indigenous cultures have, that all of our different cultures have, and think of your Black Lives Matters movements, which of course has crossed the border here too. It really amplifies racism. Even in our major cities, in Toronto, for example, the areas that have been most impacted by COVID are those where a large number of immigrants live, where people of color live, the Asian community, many of the Asian community also live, have been more vastly affected by the pandemic. There's also the issue of depletion of natural resources, especially water. And to date, at least 5 million people have been killed in water wars between countries and borders, but they're not described as water wars. So they're not obvious to us. That tremendous loss of biodiversity, and we'll consider that importance afterwards. Our short-sighted approaches to the economy. We only have to look at some, I mean, I know that people are suffering, it's a very complex issue, but we only have to look at some of the reactions to COVID to know that sometimes we have very short-sighted approaches to our economy. A tremendous decline in the quality of human life, and the pandemic has shown that up very much. Societal breakdown. And Pope Francis also speaks about the sadness of our own weak responses to all of these things. So I'll try and cheer you up a bit by the end of the evening, she says, laughing. I'm having most of the negative things here at the moment. And so I want to make the argument that theology can help. And a lot of people, I'm sure, if I said that to them, they'd say, theology? Really? Get real, Mary. But I love this statement by our own sister Elizabeth Johnson, who speaks of theology is potentially the most comprehensive of fields. If there is only one God, and if this God is the creator of all that exists, then everything is encompassed in the scope of theology's interest. So an important consideration, and I know that very often people will say, oh, theology, these people, like the Pope, should stay out of politics. You shouldn't dabble with all of these things. And yet, it is the scope of theology's interest. If we truly begin to make the cosmos and creation a primary consideration, if we understand that everything rests in that, all life rests in that, then it makes sense. So it is an invitation to take the fullness and promise of theology seriously. And of course, to make it practical theology as well as theoretical. For many of you, you'll be familiar with this, and it's a big but way back in 1967. By the way, if you've never read this article, you can still Google it, and it's worth reading. Written by a man called, a medieval historian actually, Lynn White Jr., and it's entitled The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. And it was published in Science way back. And he made the claim that Christianity is the root cause of the crisis. So something for us to take seriously. He says that Christianity normalizes a mentality of exploitation of the natural world. And we certainly do find traces of that, particularly at the time of the Industrial Revolution. Many Protestant theologians were for this sense of progress that now we have come to see as being an exploitation. Of course, he mentions that one that we all highlight in Genesis 1, that the creation story asserts human dominion over nature. And he makes the claim that, especially in its Western form, Christianity is the most anthropocentric or human-centered religion that the world has ever seen. And he highlights the fact that Christianity makes a distinction between humans, made in God's image, and the rest of creation. And some of you have already mentioned that in our brief conversations so far. And he went as far as to say this: we shall continue to have a worsening ecological crisis until we reject the Christian axiom that nature has no reason for existence save to serve man. Now you will notice I use the word man simply to be faithful to the original quote. You'll notice I put it in brackets there. So we shall continue, he said, to have a worsening ecologic crisis until we reject the Christian axiom that nature has no reason for existence save to serve man. And again, we see that in our tradition. And I think Pope Francis echoes that when he speaks about where we place ourselves in the whole of creation. In Laudato Si, he says, when human beings fail to find their true place in this world, they misunderstand themselves and end up acting against themselves. So not only does it mean destruction of the environment, but it also destroys humanity. And I think he is echoing. So he's saying that some of the claims made by people like Lynn White are in fact true of our heritage. However, something that a lot of people don't realize that Lynn White also went on to say was that but escaping religion isn't the answer to the ecological crisis. Rather, he says, we need to reframe our relationship with nature. And in order to do that, he says, surprisingly, we must either find a new religion or rethink our old one. Now that is so interesting. We must either find a new religion or rethink our old one. So it's interesting to know that he actually did see that importance of a religion, a theology, to contribute to the possibilities of promising new life for the world. And that's something I think a lot of people don't know about Lynn White, that he actually appealed to religion. I'm not going to suggest we all leave the church and find a new religion, but I am, at least this evening, going to rethink our old one, not to sort of bore people with tradition, but to look at the way that tradition, in fact, has yielded some of the really important contemporary steps in theology that we are considering now in light of our responses to the ecological crisis. They actually yield those responses. Just like evolution, we don't lose what has gone before, but we allow it and we look for signs of something evolving. It's not something that is somehow separated from what previously existed. There's continuity in evolution, and I want to suggest there's continuity in our faith too. So I am going to rethink some of our old thoughts, just to highlight those, and as I said, to get us on a level playing field. And so that we can see how that will yield new contemporary versions of theology that will help us to move forward. And where do we start with that tradition? Well, St. Francis. Pope St. John Paul II, as you know, in 1980, assigned Francis as the patron saint of ecology. Over those years, since JP2, over those years, we've seen that St. Francis has an appeal for a vast range of people, not just Catholics, not just Christians, but it's been very, very important in bringing together the ecumenical voice for initiatives in ecology and theology, and the interfaith voice. Here at the Villa, when we haven't got COVID restrictions, we have an interfaith evening prayer once a month, where much of the prayer is taken from the various traditions represented to reflect on the value of the earth. But the important thing is, and you'll probably note that Pope Francis, and in fact JP too, held meetings in Assisi. And some of those meetings were ecumenical, some were interfaith. So what this promises is a capacity for, he's such an appealing person for St. Francis, that for those who aren't Christian, he has a certain appeal. And so people will come from other faith traditions, other denominations to Assisi to pray together. And so there is that more global appeal. So that is part of the sort of starting place from the tradition that we have. And of course, we know that Pope Francis deliberately chose the name Francis because he knew that he was going to commit from his very first homily, in fact, where he talks about the protection of the earth. Interestingly enough, on the feast of St. Joseph, who he says was the protector par excellence. And he uses that, his inaugural homily, which you can also still get on Google, to talk about protection of the earth being the witness of St. Joseph too. But then, of course, he chose the name Francis. And this is what he says about it in Laudato Si. I do not want to write this encyclical without turning to that attractive and compelling figure whose name I took as my gentle guide and inspiration when I was elected Bishop of Rome. I believe St. Francis is the example par excellence of care of the vulnerable and of an integral ecology lived joyfully and authentically. And so very much when we look at the tradition, there is something there on St. Francis. And many of us, I know, look at St. Francis in very simplistic ways because he was clearly a simple man. But I think if we look very carefully at St. Francis and some of his remarkable words and actions, we find something that is very much part of contemporary theological explorations as to how we, as the body of Christ, as the people of God, as humans in partnership with others, how we come to actually begin to address these problems together. Because I think what we find revealed, even as I say, it very much so in some of the actions we read of St. Francis, what we see revealed are the very topics of a contemporary theology, that inherent dignity of all creation that is independent of all human judgment, that everything exists because it has the same divine source. Subjectivity and essential value belong to each part of creation. The interrelationship and interdependence of all creation are very strong in the actions of St. Francis. There are also some very interesting considerations in the actions of Francis that are about the use of Earth's resources and, of course, creation care. So I think we find hidden in that early Franciscan tradition, and we'll be talking about that more, the seedlings of many of the topics that we'll be talking about in contemporary theology. And in that great canticle of St. Francis, which Pope Francis begins Laudato Si with, I think we see, we could almost say that every aspect of contemporary ecological theology is found in there. Laudato Si, mi Signore. Praise be to you, my Lord. In the words of this beautiful canticle, Pope Francis says, St. Francis of Assisi reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. Praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister, Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us and who produces various fruit with colored flowers and herbs. I'm going to stick my neck out a little bit here and say all of contemporary theology is hidden somewhere in that great canticle. And if you note the fraternal and sororal language, brother, sister, in that great canticle, they speak of a cosmic dynamism and of the moral agency, not only of humans, but of all creation. And they also speak of practical concern. And this is a little bit autobiographical here. I came to realize that as quite a young child, because I grew up in Cambridge in England. And on the left, you'll see a picture of the marketplace that was there when I was a kid, many, many moons ago, and is still there. And on that marketplace, and there still is, run by another generation of a family, is a bookstore. And my mom, who didn't have much money, she had to stretch it out for the family, one day went to the market. And I'm sure she probably didn't buy herself something she might have wanted to eat, but she browsed the bookstore, and I was quite young at the time, and she found for me a beautiful old text of the lives of St. Francis, written by his contemporary, his chosen biographer, Thomas of Celano. And we discover some beautiful things in that text. Really the practical care of the earth. And so we look at what St. Francis sort of did in his life. And Thomas of Celano said that he revered all creatures. And he preached to all of these creatures, moral agency again. And he was filled with joy simply in creation. But a very notable piece in the text is what he actually did about much of this. What he did was, and I'm going to read this part of the text, it's fascinating. In beautiful things, he recognized God, who is supremely beautiful. All good things cried out to him, he who made us is the best. Now remember, this fellow was a contemporary of Francis. Everywhere he followed the beloved by the traces he has impressed on all things. He made for himself of all things a ladder to reach God. God embraced all things with an unheard of rapture. There was devotion. And so here he turned it to something practical, which hopefully we can do with our reflections on theology in the next few days. This is St. Francis at his most practical. He refused to put out lanterns, lamps, or candles, and not suffering his hand to dim the brightness, which he regarded as eternal light. Over rocks he walked reverently out of regard for God who is called the rock. When he had to recite the verse, on a rock hast thou exalted me, he used to say, in order to employ a more reverent expression, beneath my feet thou hast exalted me. And when the brethren were cutting wood, he forbade them to cut a whole tree, so that it might have hope of sprouting again. He bade the gardener not to dig up the outlying parts of the garden, in order that in their seasons the greenness of grass and the beauty of flowers might proclaim the beauteous God of all things. In the garden he ordered a plot to be set apart for sweet-scented and flowering plants, that they might cause those that should look upon them to remember eternal sweetness. Now I have to say, ever since I refound this book, which I brought across the Atlantic with me as a gift from my mom when I was a child, I have a big vegetable patch just outside this window. And At both ends of that vegetable patch, I grow flowers as well as the vegetables because of that emphasis Francis had on moving away from models of utility. And so, um, and so very much I treasure that. And interestingly enough, my mom, who bought that book for me as such a treasure and brought it home, so excited, also used to take me on nature walks to a place called Grantchester Meadows. If any of you are mystery fans, by the way, and watch PBS, I don't know whether you've ever seen that series called Grantchester. If you have, it's a real place. It is a real place, and this meadow leads to it. And my mom would take me out onto that meadow and teach me about flowers and birds and bugs, etc. And so the two for me came together. This beautiful reading from St. Francis that she so generously bought me, and those walks, those nature walks that she would take me on holidays. So there are beautiful ways, I think, that we can reach children in this capacity. However, having said those nice things about the tradition and St. Francis, it is nonetheless, as we know, an ambiguous theological tradition. And one of the best books that I've actually read on it was published as early as 1985, and it's by the Lutheran theologian H. Paul Santmeyer, and it's called The Travail of Nature, the Ambiguous Ecological Promise of Our Christian Tradition, in which she speaks about the possibility of constructing a new theology of nature in our time. And isn't that our invitation? But he says that will require a new historical understanding of biblical, classical, theological reflection about nature. But he then mentions, but wait a minute, despite the problems, the ambiguity, there are long forgotten ecological riches hidden everywhere in the deeper vaults of the tradition. And they call us to be, even today, a public witness to care for the earth. Some of you may be familiar with the Green Bible. You may remember many years ago now, I think they were called the Jesus Seminar, went through the New Testament, and they highlighted in red words that were most probably words that were actually spoken by Jesus. And so they did that biblical exegesis. More recently, somebody did a similar thing and highlighted throughout the whole Bible in green everything that is hidden in there about care and concern for the earth. And there's a beautiful foreword to that by by Desmond Tutu. And so we're asked to go back and rediscover those scriptural riches on which our theology is founded, and to re-look at exegesis. That word dominion, for example, and we'll say more about this in the next few days, that everyone gets upset about. And Pope Francis is clear in Laudato Si, this is not a correct interpretation of the Bible. Although it is true that we Christians have at times incorrectly interpreted the scriptures, nowadays we must forcibly reject the notion that our being created in God's image and given dominion over the earth justifies absolute dominion over other creatures. And that in itself calls for the new anthropology that we'll be talking about tomorrow, this exegesis. I will also, as you guessed by that question, was Jesus an ecologist, be looking at, on Saturday, looking at Jesus and Christology, the historical Jesus and Christology. But the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, are rich, very, very rich in an earth concern, and express the beauty of the earth. We know from the Psalms, etc. One of my very favorite books on the Old Testament is a little book written by Ellen Davis, who is an Episcopal theologian at Duke University, called Getting Involved with God, Rediscovering the Old Testament. And in that book, she has a lovely chapter on the Bible and ecology. And I think her words are very wise here. She says, at first blush, the concept of biblical ecology seems like an oxymoron. It's like a jumbo shrimp. Ecology, she said, as a specialized academic subject, a science, is barely a couple of generations old. And the ecological crisis we now face is largely a byproduct of technological changes that have taken place in the last 200 years. The Bible comes from a primarily agrarian society. Miriam, you mentioned the agrarian sort of situation earlier. That would have been puzzled by our academic specializations and compartmentalization. Nonetheless, Ellen Davis says, I think it is no exaggeration to say that the Bible can teach us, or better perhaps, help us to understand all the fundamentals of ecology. The Bible can enable us to grasp the depth dimensions of the ecological crisis, because the ecological crisis is essentially not a technological crisis, but a theological one. It is a massive disordering of our relationship with God, the creator of heaven and earth. Ecology, then, is distinctly a theological subject, even a distinctly Old Testament subject. So I invite you, as we sort of move forward, to perhaps do a little bit of more rediscovering of that great biblical heritage. And so you don't have to listen to me all the evening. I'm going to ask you a question that we can have, if you're together with others, a little conversation about, or reflect on if you're on your own. And again, we'll have some sharing afterwards. Let's take a little bit of time to ask ourselves the question, as we reflect on the Bible, what is one thing that you have learned from the Bible about ecology? So let's just take some moments now for a little conversation to reflect on that. And I'm sorry, I know conversation is easier if we're face to face, but I hope this will work for you. What is one thing you have learned from the Bible about ecology? And so let's take a few moments of quietness and then a little conversation. We'll take 10 minutes for some discussion on this now. And then we'll have some sharing. So, what is one thing I have learned from the Bible about ecology? So I'm going to stop my screen share again so that I can at least see your lovely faces as you're doing this. There we go. Okay, so let's take some time to reflect on that question. Think about the Bible, Old or New Testament. Ask yourself, what is one thing that you have learned from the Bible about ecology? Okay, so maybe I can invite you to some sharing. I'm sorry it's not, quite as vibrant as when we're all together in one room, but maybe I can invite you to some sharing about your responses to that question, because as somebody said at the beginning, I forget which one of you it was now. It's wonderful to hear one another's voices coming into this conversation. So, please open to share with one another your thoughts about the significance of Scripture, of the Bible, for teaching us something about ecology. Anne?
Possibly because of the fact that I live in the West and we're having horrendous heat and horrendous fires here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I'm so struck by the image of water in the Bible over and over and over, and the respect for which the nomadic people cared for their wells, and the fact that it was a place where sometimes enemies could actually meet because there was the need for their animals and for them to get water. And then you have all the Psalms, the stag, I thirst for the water. You get into the New Testament and Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. And the fact that Jesus is referred to in the New Testament as living water, water that moves. And so that it just goes through the entire story of life. And it speaks as truly today as it did 4,000 or 5,000 years ago.
Right. Thank you, Anne. Thank you. Yeah, some beautiful reflections there on the great prevalence of the natural world in the biblical texts, and how it relates to our well-being and peace, as you've indicated too, how it can contribute to peace as well, and the bringing together of quite different peoples. Yes, so beautiful. Anyone else? Riches from the Bible. Yeah, Patty.
The depth of beauty of the earth and its inhabitants as described with such poetic depth in the Psalms.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm particularly thinking of Psalm 104.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, beautiful. Yes, yes, I think we can recover. Many people sort of got tired of the Psalms because, we used to sort of pray the office, the divine office and whatever. And yet that beautiful wealth, my sense about the Psalms, and I once heard a sister say this, was that they're the quintessential prayers of the human heart.
Mm-hmm.
And so to recover those great works of poetry, perhaps in a different translation. I love that Nan Merrill translation of the Psalms, but yeah, that great soaring beauty. Thank you, Patty.
I think that's really beautiful. When you take the word ecology is a study of,
Mm-hmm.
and to shape your own mind, educare, that's what that does. See, so ecology, if you really, really want to understand it, you need to pray over it, ponder it, and that shapes one's mind, educare. Those to separate words out, it's kind of simplistic, but it's very meaningful.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Regina. Yes. Very, very, very powerful in our lives, isn't it? Yes.
Yes.
So beautiful. Thank you. Anyone else? Diane. Daniel, are you putting your hand up, or are you adjusting a
Well,
camera?
every time I hit the microphone button, so actually that works. That works because it looks like I'm raising my hand, but I'm hitting the microphone. So
Okay. All
it's
right.
still
That's fine. That's fine. I
yeah.
wasn't sure. Sorry,
Yeah.
Diane. I'll come back to you. Yeah.
Yeah. She mentioned earlier the Psalm 104, and that's what I was going to talk about too.
Yeah.
And how the people in the Old Testament, they understood the value of the earth's renewal.
Yes. Yes.
And and they wanted it to be God's will that it would be renewed. So they prayed for it to be God's will. To send out your spirit. So that's kind of where we're at, with Laudato Si, trying to
yes,
work with God and be responsible stewardship.
Thank you, Daniel.
And with the acknowledgement that it's with God's help. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, there's grace in there somewhere, isn't there? Yeah, in that whole movement. Yes. Yeah, thank you. Diane, sorry, you had your Diane and then Christine, I think. You have your hand up. So Diane first.
Thank you. I was thinking about Psalm 8 and how that all of creation expresses the majesty and splendor of God.
Yes. Yeah, that revelation. One of my tasks is sometimes to teach foundations in theology when they can't get anyone else, and most of the textbooks that are used for university students have a chapter on Revelation, and it never speaks of creation as revelation. It speaks of scripture, tradition, etc., etc. But very rarely, if at all, have I ever seen a textbook with creation as an aspect of revelation in it. So I just sneak it into my opening lectures on Revelation. Thank you, Diane. Yes, that great majesty and beauty. Christine, our friend, Christine.
Hi. I was also reflecting that Jesus was always using images of nature to describe God's kingdom.
Yes, the kingdom of God is like, and on Saturday morning, I'm going to be doing a little bit of work on that with us, because I think you're exactly right that I want to say to my own question, could Jesus have been an ecologist? I want to respond with, you bet, because of some of those examples. So thank you, Christine. Anyone else? I wish I was with you all so that we could have some lively conversations together, but this is great. Anyone else? Okay, please feel free to raise a hand, literally or symbolically, if there's anything you want to say, so that I'm not over talking at you. So thank you for those comments, and it's worth us, and it is a call to go back to reading scripture. And so we learn a great deal, don't we, from the Bible. There are also some great riches in the tradition. And so I just want to do, finally for this evening, this little overview of the tradition and the riches in part of it, some of the highlights of the tradition, and then use those, if you like, as a seedbed for the contemporary theology that we'll be talking about. And so even if we look at the early church, and I shouldn't say even if, it seems to me that we kind of lost it somewhere in the middle. There was always that sense, even from the sort of first, second centuries in the early church, of the immanence of God, that God who was omnipresent, always incarnational, in creation. And And we hear, for example, St. Irenaeus in his wonderful text against the heresies saying, "He who fills the heavens and fills the abysses is also present with every one of us. For he says, am I not a God at hand and not a God far off? If any man is hid in secret places, shall I not see him? For his hand lays hold of all things." It's that lovely revelation you were talking about a moment ago, Diane. And there was a great emphasis in the early church on communion, on interrelationship and interdependence. So we find those modern themes of both science and theology that we will be talking about hidden in the very early years and texts of the church. The early Orthodox theology was absolutely full of these beautiful, diffuse, mystical, circular understandings of creation. And in fact, in the Eastern Rite liturgies, there's still much more creation mentioned than in the Western Rite. Although sometimes I have students go through the text of the Mass or the Anglican Episcopal services to go through the text. Sometimes I set them a project, whatever denomination they are, to go through the texts of their common Sunday worship and discover in that the magnificence of creation and its teaching. It really is quite a lovely thing to do, and I invite you actually to do it, to go through the text of the Mass from the very beginning in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and find those creation images within it. But the Eastern rites do it so beautifully. They very much more than we do emphasize the redemption of all creation. They speak of hearts on fire for creation. The compassionate heart of God cannot bear the slightest suffering of anything in creation. There's a very tender approach in the Eastern liturgies. And so we read it from even the early days of the Eastern Church, from John of Damascus. I do not worship matter. I worship the creator of matter, who became matter for my sake. Look at this already, this beautiful sense of the creator, this emphasis on creation, and not only on redemption, which we've tended to do, who willed to take God's abode in matter, incarnation, who worked out my salvation through matter. Never will I cease honoring the matter which wrought my salvation. I honor it, but not as God. Because of this, I salute all remaining matter with reverence, because God has filled it with grace and power, and through it, my salvation has come to me. They speak very much, and I will tomorrow on Trinity, but they speak very much of this theological word, perichoresis. Trinitarian relationships remind us of divine and human together, that beautiful mutual indwelling of God in all creation. And more recently, of course, that's been expanded to include all relationships with all of creation. And some of the wonderful theologians or spiritual writers, I think, really emphasize that beautiful sense of mutual indwelling. Jürgen Moltmann, the Protestant theologian, I think is probably the favorite theologian of mine when it comes to really sort of looking at the fundamentals of ecology, Miroslav Volf. And of course, those of you who get the daily reflections from Richard Rohr will notice that he too speaks about this divine indwelling. And what it helps us to do, particularly those words of John of Damascus, it speaks of incarnation, it speaks of an immanent God, but also a transcendent God. And so for years and years, people who were interested in ecology, and we used to get terrible emails and phone calls about us being heretics because we were one of the first to sort of have a spirituality center based on the environment too. People would say it's pantheism. It's the reason that poor Teilhard de Chardin was silenced in the church. But it's not that. It's this understanding of both a transcendent God and an immanent God. Panentheism, God reflected in all of creation, not simply that creation is God. And to this day, there is a lot of misconceptions about that. So those two important words, panentheism, where God is present and reflected in creation, pantheism, which is just God reduced to creation, with no recognition of transcendence. So I think early Orthodox theology is the first to help us sort that out. The Celtic tradition, as we know, is perhaps an era par excellence for the reflection on nature. Their great Celtic scholar, John Scotus Erigena, said that every visible and invisible, that should be thing, I'm sorry, can be called a theophany, a revelation of God. This beautiful revelatory attitude in a world of wonder and mystery. And those of you who use modern Celtic prayers will still see these beautiful themes, particularly the prayers of Iona, bringing that to the fore. And an emphasis on the Holy Spirit's activity, which affirms God's continual presence in creation and calls us to a new understanding of Christology. And the goal of Celtic prayer was indeed the sanctification of all of life. And even Thomas Aquinas, I say even Thomas Aquinas, wrote this beautiful text in the Summa. Interestingly enough, much of Thomas Aquinas's work in creation didn't come, first of all, from him, but he relied on all the wonderful translations of Aristotle that were first presented by Islamic and Jewish scholars. And so here we have that lovely interfaith dimension. But then in the Summa, we hear Thomas saying, and God brought forth things into being in order that divine goodness might be communicated to creatures and be represented by them. And listen to these words, so ancient, so modern. And because the divine goodness could not be adequately represented by one creature alone, God produced many and diverse creatures, that what was wanting in one representation of divine goodness might be supplied by another. Thus, the universe participates in divine goodness more perfectly and represents it better than any single creature whatever. Look at that modern concept of unity in diversity already found in Aquinas's work, which I suspect comes from those Jewish and Islamic translations of Aristotle. Unity in diversity. We're not the kingpins. The whole of creation, the whole diversity of creation is needed in order to reflect God. And in the mystical tradition too, we find similar sort of soundings. Hildegard of Bingen, all that the earth issues forth is connected and bound to God. The earth is at the same time mother. She is mother of all, for contained in her are the seeds of all. The earth of humankind contains all moistness, all verdancy, all germinating power. It is in so many ways fruitful. All other parts of creation come from it, yet it forms not only the basic raw material for humankind, but also the substance of God's Son. Tremendously powerful words on incarnation there. And I wonder how many of us, people used to say, well, people doubt Jesus's divinity, but I suspect we often doubt Jesus's true humanity. How many of us want to say, as Hildegard of Bingen did, look, we're all made from this raw material, including God's Son. Can we really see that he too is of the earth, the second Adam? So incarnation and the humanity of Christ is emphasized there. And so too, we find the seeds of those modern reflections on deep incarnation and the very holiness of materiality and bodies. the Ignatian tradition, which we don't need to be told about, I suspect, most of us, that finding God in all things, contemplatio, God in all things, we will be, when we look at the practical, reminding ourselves of what it would be in this context to become a contemplative in action, looking at the world in an incarnational way and seeking freedom and detachment. And again, when we look at some of the practical things, we'll look at that issue of freedom and what that means for the well-being of the earth. And then we moved into a more modern era of evolutionary approach. The first, of course, to take that up, Teilhard de Chardin, his beautiful work in the Divine Milieu, really that address of religion to evolutionary theory, which at the time, of course, was still being rejected by some, and hence his silencing by the church and his exile to the United States at that time. Then the great Protestant process theologians who talk about God being able to be moved, not something static, moved. Walter Brueggemann, a biblical scholar, those beautiful reflections on shalom. Now, we don't have time in these days to look at shalom, but that is beautiful. To reflect on some of the new writings on Sabbath is wonderful. A beautiful writer, a Lutheran writer, Joseph Sittler, reflects on ecology and faith generally. And Jürgen Moltmann, again, the Protestant theologian whom I mentioned before, speaks to us of God's capacity for suffering with. God is suffering in this world as the earth cries. And then that movement to the liberation theologians who spoke of two bleeding wounds, the wound of poverty and the wound brought about by the systemic assaults on the earth. And actually, of course, as many know, the liberation theologians like Gutierrez, for example, hadn't even thought about this until they listened to the feminist theologians who spoke of oppression and the call for a Christian engagement in that daily life. Those two bleeding wounds. And don't we see it whenever we look around us at the destruction of the earth, issues of racism again, issues of extreme poverty and suffering. And yet, as Jürgen Moltmann would say, God suffers with. And so some beautiful work taken from that evolutionary approach, which I think Ilio Delio sums up beautifully in her book, The Unbearable Wholeness of Beings. She talks, in my view, evolution is the story, the meta-narrative of our age. It is not only a scientific explanation for physical reality, it is rather the overarching description of reality. Everything evolves, the cosmological framework for all contemporary thought. And while scientists continue to understand how evolution works for physical systems, it is important for us to understand how evolution works for religious systems, since physical reality and spiritual reality are intertwined. And of course, I think that is still one of the stumbling blocks. A lot of people rely on, and of course there is some stability there. It's why I'm dealing with some of the tradition at the moment. But of course there is some continuity, as I've said. But for many of us, we hang on, do we not, to a certain security in knowing that this at least is not going to change. And yet here is Ilia Delio basing her work on Teilhard de Chardin, saying, wait a minute, no. Evolution is the meta-narrative. We have to understand that our faith, our understanding of God changes, and we have to understand that everything is interconnected in an integral ecology and an integral theology, which we'll be talking about tomorrow. And so I think all of that great tradition gives us a grounding and a springboard as we look in these days at the profound invitation to choose new life by reflecting on theology and ecology, and indeed on pandemic as well. I have one last slide and one other thing to do, but just before we do that, are there any comments, any questions, any concerns that you'd like to express? I know you all have a richness to bring to this, so please never be shy to add your piece. It's so valuable.
I just know that Teilhard de Chardin was so emphatically important at Vatican Council II,
Yes.
even though he had been put away.
Yes.
He finally got heard.
Yes. And interestingly enough, and it came as a bit of a surprise to me, I have to say, Pope Benedict spoke probably somewhere towards the end of his papacy. He spoke very strongly about how much de Chardin had influenced his thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he made that marvelous contribution into this sort of evolutionary thought. So important for eco-theology, I think, and so important for us as Christians, as humans. Any other comments or questions or worries or concerns at the moment? We will integrate in conversation during all of the sessions, and you may have noticed by your email today that there'll also be some exercises that we can do together as well. So thank you. So just one other thing, and for this I would like to thank your own Marcia. Sorry, not this one, I forgot I put this slide on. So when we look at this, making a choice, John Paul II was very strong when he said this, and it was being followed up by Benedict and by Francis. Care for the environment is not an option, although I think many of us think it is not an option. In the Christian perspective, it forms an integral part of our personal life and of life in society. Not to care for the environment is to ignore the Creator's plan for all of creation and results in the alienation of the human person. It is not a choice or an add-on. And yet, I don't know, as I say, I don't know how much you hear about it in parishes or around where you're living, but it's not an option for us. This making a choice for new life, to which we've been invited in these days, is an integral part of our personal life, of society, and of our faith. It is about God's design for creation and our part in it. And this, of course, does bring me to you, Marcia, and to say thank you for all the magnificent thoughts on the vocation of those of us who are part of the family of Joseph, because it is all about our vocation, this choice. And I would say, of course, that extends not just to those of us in the family of Joseph, but to all Christians too. And I think you say it so beautifully in Love's Design when you say this. Love's Design, our vocation, engages us in the mystery of relationship with God and with others, all of which engage us totally in that dimensionless love with which God lavishes on creation. You go on to say we are to communicate God's desire and design for creation. And these beautiful words: we must live at the heart of creation, immersed in its reality, fully alive to its sufferings and triumph, for this is where God is. For those words, a huge thank you, Marcia. Our very vocation, Christian, and particularly of the family of Joseph, rests on this immersion into reality, alive to its sufferings and triumph, for this is where God is. And so with a bit of luck, we're going to end, thanks to Donna, my good technician here. I lost Christine. She used to be my technician, but Donna is going to play for us to end the evening that beautiful Canticle of St. Francis, in which I think all of contemporary theology is somehow or other embedded initially. So I'm going to stop screen sharing, and Donna will play that beautiful hymn to take us into our evening. Thank you, Donna.
You're welcome.
The sun, the bringer of days. He carries the light of the Lord in his rays, the moon and the stars who light up the way unto your throne. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and all creation is shouting for joy. Come dance in the forest, come play in the field, and sing to the glory of the Lord. Praise for the wind that blows through the trees, the sea's mighty storms, the gentlest breeze. They blow where they will, they blow where they please, to please the Lord. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and all creation is shouting for joy. Come dance in the forest, come play in the field, and sing to the glory of the Lord. Praise for the rain that waters our fields and blesses our crops, so all the earth yields. From death unto life, her mystery revealed, springs forth in joy. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and all creation is shouting for joy. Come dance in the forest, come play in the field, and sing to the glory of the Lord. Praise for the earth who makes life to grow, the creatures you made to let your life show, the flowers and trees that help us to know the heart of love. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and all creation is shouting for joy. Come dance in the forest, come play in the field, and sing the glory of the Lord. Sing to the glory of the Lord.
Thank you, Donna. And so, thank you all as well, and I wish you the joyful rest of the evening. You've got an extra hour to us now, and look forward to seeing you at your time, 9:30 in the morning, and in the meantime, have a lovely evening and a very gentle night.
9:15 in the morning.
9:15, thank you. Okay, 9:15, thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, bye-bye
Thank
now.
you.
Good night all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.